For this week's guest, we are joined by Ian Proud. He is a former British diplomat who served from 1999 to 2023. From July 2014 to February 2019, he was posted to the British Embassy in Moscow, where he advised UK ministers on sanctions against Russia. And he's written about his experience with a brand new book. It's called A Misfit in Moscow: How British Diplomacy in Russia Failed. And we're going to speak to Ian about that and also about the state of the proxy war in Ukraine. And he has a lot of really interesting things to share with us about that. So let's go to Ian Proud. Ian Proud, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for inviting me. It's really nice to meet you both.
Well, likewise. And it's great to have you on because you are a veteran diplomat. And there's been some talk of diplomacy recently. With a peace summit, a so-called peace summit convened by the Ukrainian government with its international backers. There's also been Vladimir Putin making his most concrete public offer of peace with Ukraine to date. So I'm curious your reaction to all of this. Let's start with the peace summit. This was a big deal for the Ukrainian government. A lot was riding on the summit for them. What is your assessment of how things went?
I mean, I think you summed it up well, Aaron, by saying the so-called peace summit, because really 2/3 of the representatives there were from European countries or Western allies that have sanctioned Russia. And there's a handful of 27 other countries that kind of signed on to this declaration, including global titans like Comoros and Timor-Leste. But actually, what it really proved was that the global south and like the BRICS group was turned off by this, which they saw as a one-sided kind of echo chamber for Zelensky to really kind of push for his so-called 10-point peace formula, which basically means please give me more weapons. So BRICS kind of refused to kind of sign that. The global south too. The whole thing's been kicked into the long grass, quite frankly, and it doesn't really take us any further forward to the actual point at which peace may be secured, which will unfortunately, whether Zelensky likes it or not, involve him sitting around the table with Putin.
What do you make of the fact that Joe Biden didn't even show up for this peace conference? And it's not like it would have taken him a long time to get there. He was already in Europe for the G7 summit in Italy. And rather than just stopping over in Switzerland on his way home, he flew back. And Zelensky was very upset by that. He didn't make it secret that he wanted Biden to be there, and Biden didn't show up.
Yeah, and Kamala Harris only actually stayed for a day as well of the 2-day event. So, I mean, it says a lot. But then again, the US position is well known, right? I mean, they're going to supply, or the Biden administration is going to supply Zelensky weapons for as long as it takes to fight them to the last Ukrainian. So, I mean, I think US support was assured. It seems a bit cheap not to show up at all. But, it's not as if we found out anything new about the US position from Biden's absence, or indeed had he been there.
Can you talk a little bit about your experience as a diplomat and in particular what you think the media and politicians in the West most get wrong about Russia and Putin?
So there's an awful lot of fake narrative around Russia. One of the biggest ones, I suppose, is that kind of Russia is this imperialist empire that's intent on invading Lithuania, Poland, Estonia next if they succeed in Ukraine. There's absolutely never been any evidence that was the case, not least because they're all NATO countries and NATO vastly outnumbers Russia in its size. I mean, that's one of the kind of biggest fake narratives that kind of really propels the West forward in boosting up its own defense spending, which is already more than 10 times bigger than Russia's, but also kind of maintaining the stance that, we have to keep sending weapons into Ukraine. So that's a big one. There are lots of other kind of weird sub-narratives as well, like, Putin's on the verge of death. And that if we only wait a bit longer, then he'll be gone and the world will be a better place again. I mean, I've been hearing this rumor for a decade, since I first arrived in Moscow in the summer of 2014. He still appears to be in the rudeness of health. Dare I say, possibly healthier even than the president of the US, who knows? But that's another one. Full-scale invasion is another really common narrative that comes in. Russia launched this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Clearly, they did so with about 150, 160,000 troops out of a total military strength of 1.5 million. So that's not really true. I mean, if you look at any kind of Western press report about what's happening in Ukraine. It's littered with all these kind of narratives around, Yanukovych's downfall in February of 2014 as well. I mean, it's just, from my point of view, sort of certainly reading Western media feels much like, frankly, reading the Russian media, ironically.
In Putin's recent speech that he gave to Russian foreign ministry officials, where he laid out his public peace offer to Ukraine, which was basically Ukraine should declare neutrality, as its founding constitution actually once did. So that's not exactly a radical demand. But he also demanded that Ukraine withdraw from all 4 regions that Russia has laid claim to, even though Russia doesn't fully control those regions. Putin also said, though, and I'm curious your reaction to this, that the aim of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was to, in his words, I'm paraphrasing, was to coerce diplomacy, that Ukraine was refusing to implement the Minsk Accords. Ukraine sponsors, namely the U.S., were refusing to negotiate with Russia over its December 2021 draft treaty addressing Russian grievances about NATO expansion. And so the aim of the invasion, he said, was to basically impose the diplomacy that Ukraine and its sponsors were refusing to undertake. And it almost worked because there were negotiations immediately. This led up to Istanbul. As we know, there was almost a deal there until all that collapsed. But I'm curious, I mean, just on Putin's claim about trying to impose diplomacy at the barrel of a gun, do you think that's a fair assessment of Russian goals when it invaded Ukraine?
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's what Putin said. There's no reason not to take him as well. I mean, if you take a step back to kind of February 2015, when the Minsk agreements were settled, they imposed requirements on the Ukrainian authorities, much like they imposed requirements on the kind of separatist authorities in the Donbass, to kind of move towards some sort of peace process that secured Ukraine's border, but critically actually led to some sort of negotiated devolution in the Donbass, which would give the kind of separatists more of a political stake in kind of self-government while still remaining within the territory of the Republic of Ukraine, right? So the Ukrainian government had to kind of push forward, and of course they never did, and the US and the UK in particular never really kind of forced the Ukrainians to kind of hold up in good faith their end of the bargain within the Minsk II agreements, which quickly rendered those agreements kind of dead in the water. So kind of fast forward to sort of January 2022, you got Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, saying, well, we will never offer devolution to the Donbass. I mean, this is what we said, look it up, and I'm not making it up, but you can sort of read it online. Basically kind of killing or just frankly confirming that the Minsk agreements have been dead for, the preceding 7 years. And, that was one of many reasons, in addition to kind of, Putin's ventures at the end of 2021 on NATO expansion being rebuffed, which, made Putin decide to roll the dice in the way that he did.
In Putin's speech, he talked about actually an episode early on in the invasion where he was speaking to someone he described as a Western diplomat. I think he's talking about Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister of Israel, who asked him about, well, you have Russian troops, not just in the Donbass, but these 2 other regions, including Zaporizhia. And he said, well, like, what is your plan there? Do you plan to permanently occupy those places? And Putin claims that he said that actually, if Ukraine could promise us a land bridge to Crimea, then we wouldn't have to be there, basically. That's what I took from Putin's message. And those regions that he's talking about are the regions that he's now claimed to annex. So I'm wondering if you saw in that maybe Putin was saying that, well, if Ukrainian troops withdraw from those regions, then maybe we can discuss some arrangement where we just get a land bridge to Crimea and Ukraine could ultimately keep land that Russia has now claimed as its own.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, there was definitely scope to kind of retrench back to the pre-February 2022 borders, including possibly a kind of land bridge through to Crimea, through kind of Mariupol at that time. But of course, that was killed dead in the water as soon as the Istanbul negotiations fell apart upon what we now know to be kind of US insistence, but what we've known for a long time to be kind of UK insistence too. So yeah, I mean, I think that's entirely kind of consistent with the evidence from that time that have come out of the negotiations that were taking place, really from just like a few days after the war actually started in February 22. So yeah.
As someone who worked for the British government, what can you tell us that isn't already kind of widely known about what Boris Johnson did when he spoke to Zelensky and urged him not to negotiate with Putin?
Well, I mean, you can read what Boris has said himself. He's said publicly that he didn't want Zelensky to take the agreement, and Zelensky didn't. And we now know what the US position on that was. But I mean, what Boris did was entirely consistent with the line that the UK government had been taking for the previous kind of 8 years prior to the invasion itself. So he wasn't sort of swimming against the tide of where the UK policy establishment swamp, if you like, in Whitehall, and actually ministers had been really since the summer of 2014. So there's nothing sort of new that you can elucidate from what happened. He didn't want Zelensky to take it. He said publicly they didn't want Zelensky to take it, and Zelensky didn't. And of course, within weeks, you've got Liz Truss. I can tell you internally was an absolute massive hawk who just was seething at the mouth, wanting to punish Russia in every way possible by sanctioning people who weren't politically connected either in the US or in UK, oligarchs, and so on. And from inside of the kind of the walls of King Charles Street at the time, I mean, she would do anything to kind of punish Russia. And of course, you found within just over 2 weeks after Zelensky had binned the Istanbul agreements, she was actually calling for Ukraine to then take back Crimea. Not entirely clear how they would have done that, which is a line that the US administration continues with today. I mean, Kirby was saying something very similar in a recent interview, for example. So yeah, from inside of the shed, I mean, Truss was absolutely determined to play the kind of modern day neo-Margaret Thatcher, with like Ukraine being her version of the Falklands, wanting to kind of win at all costs.
And what kind of carrots and sticks were used to get Zelensky to agree?
I don't think he really needed much persuading, to be honest. I think what we had promised him was that we would support. This is the key point. I think that we'd support him for as long as it takes. This awful phrase, as long as it takes. And of course, what we now know is that actually, it's been taking too long, and Western support for continued weapon shipments to Ukraine has been sort of gradually, slowly kind of withering away, and the future of that remains uncertain, to the point where now actually the key areas of support that kind of the West, including G7, is supplying to Ukraine is in the form of loans. This infamous kind of 50 billion, using the interest from the kind of stolen Russian assets in Belgium, for example. So we're moving beyond actual handouts to loans on top of what was already a massively indebted country, Ukraine, and nobody's really thinking long term about what that means for Ukraine as and when, if kind of a war ever stops.
And is what Boris Johnson did, I mean, just as someone who worked in diplomacy, that would have required the go-ahead from the United States?
Well, no, I mean, because very clearly in the New York Times kind of story very much confirms that actually what Johnson was saying was entirely consistent with what US policymakers were saying too. And, bear in mind that the UK and US had been in lockstep on Ukraine, right, since the start of the Maidan protest. Victoria Nuland, who had a direct phone line into kind of King Charles Street, in Whitehall on this. I mean, we were in lockstep with the US. So there's not a fag paper difference, frankly, between the two positions.
Well, let me ask you about that New York Times article because it's fascinating. The fact that it's published is extraordinary. So these Istanbul talks are more than 2 years old. According to all parties, they almost had a deal.
I was in that moment in the group of Ukrainian negotiators. We negotiate with Russian delegation practically 2 months, in March and April, the possible peaceful settlement agreement between Ukraine and Russia. And we, as you remember, concluded so-called Istanbul communique. And we were very close in the middle of April, in the end of April, to finalize our war with some peaceful settlement. For some reasons, it was postponed. But to my mind, Putin, this is my personal view, Putin in 1 week after started his aggression in 24 February last year, very quickly understood he did mistake and tried to do everything possible to conclude agreement with Ukraine. And Istanbul communique, it was his personal decision to accept the text of this communique, which totally far away from the initial proposal of Russia, ultimatum proposal of Russia, which they put before the Ukrainian delegation in Minsk. So we managed to find a very real compromise. So Putin really wanted to reach some peaceful settlement with Ukraine. It's very important to remember.
A Ukrainian negotiator said that we found a real compromise and Putin did everything possible to make peace. That wasn't a Russian saying that. That was a Ukrainian negotiator. For the first time, the New York Times prints that Ukrainian negotiator's statement and acknowledges that these talks made real progress after ignoring Istanbul for so long. But now we get a new excuse from the Times as to why they failed. So the Times, first of all, does not mention that Boris Johnson came to Kyiv and told Zelensky, you should keep fighting. They don't even mention that. But we get a new excuse. Now we hear from the Times that according to Ukraine, at the last minute, Russia tried to insert a clause that basically said that if Ukraine is attacked, then if the guarantor states are going to provide military assistance to Ukraine to defend itself, everybody has to agree on their response. And that, Ukraine says, was Russia's attempt to basically veto any future defense of Ukraine against a future Russian attack. Because according to Ukraine, the argument here is that if Russia attacked Ukraine again, Russia could then veto any military response by Ukraine's partners, because under this proposed peace deal that Russia was trying to push through, Russia would have a veto. But the problem with that argument, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, is that the agreement already says that Russia agrees not to attack Ukraine again. That's Article 2. It's like, right, that's the whole premise of this whole agreement. So it wouldn't make sense for Russia to attack Ukraine again and then say nobody can come help Ukraine, because that would be in violation of the treaty. If Russia's already attacking Ukraine, then they're already in violation. And second of all, this is a brand new excuse. We've previously got other excuses. First, we were told that the reason the talks didn't work out was because of Bucha, the alleged Russian atrocities that were discovered in Bucha. But that never made sense, because the talks continued well after Bucha came to light. And then we got another excuse from the top Ukrainian negotiator, David Abrahamian, I think is how you pronounce his name. He said that this didn't work, A, because Boris Johnson told us not to, and B, because we didn't trust Russia. But now we get a new excuse that it's because Russia tried to insert this last minute clause. So I'm curious your thoughts on whether you think that this excuse is believable.
Look, I don't think it's believable. I mean, I think everybody's trying to retrofit the narrative now to suit their own purposes, right? And, of course, they have to say that after the rather embarrassing kind of leak of these state documents. Look, what is clear is that agreement, irrespective of the issue of security guarantees and which states would have been parties to security guarantees, would have taken NATO membership off the table. And that is and has always been the kind of critical point for Russia, and is the point that it ultimately kind of precipitated. When Russia felt that actually the West was insincere in its desire to kind of find a way around, NATO aspiration for Ukraine, that's really the point at which kind of Russia decided to kind of spin the drum and invade in the way that it did. So it's always been that one issue, kind of NATO membership. And I think actually a deal that took that off the table and sort of set in stone, if you like, or at least set in stone while a longer term peace process took place at kind of borders, post kind of February sort of 2014, I think that would have taken off the table sort of good cause for Russia to invade again. So I think that's just a kind of fiction as people try to retrofit and paddle quick to kind of make up for this embarrassing leak of US documents.
Your book, which I really recommend, Misfit in Moscow, it has a lot of great anecdotes and, of course, kind of an insightful analysis. And I know that you mentioned in the intro that there was some censorship that happened. And obviously you can't tell us what was censored, because that would get you in trouble. But I'm curious if there's anything in general you can tell us about the types of information or the type of information that the British government didn't want you to reveal.
So it was anything that referred to the intelligence agencies, specifically the UK intelligence agencies and the operations in Russia. And there was really nothing at all, but even mentioning them by name, MI6, oh my God, can't even mention them by name in the books if they didn't really exist. For example, that would be one. Anything that referred to conversations that happened with actual kind of Russian officials was off limits. So I could only refer in vague terms to kind of people that I knew on the Russian side. And they're a bit shy about anything suggesting that senior sort of, UK diplomats actually might like, senior Russian officials in any way. That caused some sharp intakes of breath. But, really, there's nothing substantive in terms of the narrative. I mean, I don't feel I took anything away that actually detracted from what I had to say, but so can't mention MI6, MI5 and that kind of stuff. But, it didn't really affect, what I wanted to write about, so I didn't worry that much about it.
Right. I also heard you during an interview with Anatol Lieven. You talked about how the sanctions have backfired. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing about sanctions, certainly European sanctions, is that they can evade a real lowest common denominator thing. The lowest thing that absolutely everybody at the time, 28 country grouping, can agree with. So lots of countries kind of didn't want things included. SWIFT wasn't included. The big kind of banking transaction service wasn't included. Several banks in Eastern Europe weren't included. The French took a long time to cancel this helicopter carrier deal, this Mistral deal, $1.1 billion dollar deal, but eventually did, under sufferance. So the whole sanctions themselves were negotiation, right? So the impact was kind of not as strong as it could have been right from the start. And US sanctions anyway, because US trade was tiny compared to kind of European trade with Russia, right? So that's kind of one thing. And the second thing, bigger things happened. I mean, there's an oil price collapse at the end of 2014. There was a second one at the start of 2016. COVID happened. All of these things had a far bigger economic impact on Russia than the sanctions themselves. And actually, Russia has a very kind of capable sort of economic policy making team. The central bank governor, the finance minister, are the same people now that they were when I arrived in Moscow in the summer of 2014. And these are not Siloviki kind of KGB diehard, types. These are kind of liberal, kind of economically literate, very capable, very smart people who've been helping the Russian economy navigate those different sort of shifts and pressures that it's been under over the past 10 years, and they've done it incredibly well. And because of that, 10 year. I mean, people think about sanctions in terms of what's happened since 2022. Actually, Russia's been living with them since 2014. 10 years now. They've had a lot of time to kind of reorient their economy, shift it more to Asia and that sort of thing, and they've done a very good job of it.
And I think you talked about a kind of artisanal explosion.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, like cheese. I mean, we had the shrine in the embassy towards all the kind of Western food products that would go like, Western milk, Finnish milk, for example, very popular, English cheeses and that kind of stuff. It all went off the shelves into the summer of 2014. And there's this big explosion of artisanal sort of cheese making is the example I always use, but also kind of a real focus on sort of pop-ups of culture. All these kind of Soviet-style markets in the center of Moscow were really kind of tidied up and made really kind of trendy and hip with bars, and you get everything, amazing steaks and locally made cheese. I mean, it was quite remarkable how Russia decided the strategic areas it wanted to prioritize, agriculture kind of being one of them, and food production, to reduce its reliance on kind of Western food imports. And they just went with it, and they did it actually very, very well. And I have to say, the cheese is also very nice, just saying.
Although you must miss cheddar, right? Or they must miss cheddar in Russia.
I used to bring it back in my suitcase. Yeah, I used to bring it back in my suitcase when I had just in fact the head of a sort of big Russian bank told me that when he was a Soviet diplomat in London, he used to bring cheddar back from the horrible imperialist kind of the West when he came back to the Soviet Union from London at the time. So yeah, nice. Cheddar is a globally a tradable commodity.
Yeah,
one of the few things we have left after Brexit. We'll always have cheddar.
The February 2014 coup. How involved do you think the West was in the overthrow of the Yanukovych government? I'm curious if you also heard Putin in his speech. He talked about an episode I don't think he's spoken about publicly before, where he spoke to President Obama right before Yanukovych was overthrown. And he says that him and Obama agreed that they would support this power sharing deal that was reached between Yanukovych and the opposition that would have left Yanukovych in power in exchange for a power sharing government in early elections. But basically, right after that, the hardline faction of the Maidan coup, the ultranationalists, the neo-Nazis, refused to accept it. They carried out more violence. Yanukovych fled the capital, ultimately fled to Russia. And Putin spoke very bitterly about he felt he was betrayed by the U.S. on that, because right after that happened, even though the Obama administration claimed to support the power sharing deal, as soon as Yanukovych fled and a new coup government was pushed through in parliament, despite there being a lack of quorum and parliamentary procedure, the U.S. welcomed it and said that Yanukovych had lost his legitimacy to rule, and so he felt betrayed. And he said that this led him to suspect that the U.S. was behind all these events. So, what is your sense of how involved the West was in what happened during those fateful days of February 2014.
Well, the West was very, very involved in what happened in those fateful days. And actually, the key point about what happened in 2014 is that there's really a tussle between European and sort of US and UK, even though we're still part of the EU, kind of diplomacy on kind of the way forward. Because actually that power sharing deal, was a deal that's brokered very much by the kind of the French, the Poles and the Germans. The foreign ministers coming in and kind of brokering that deal. That was a European deal that they'd brokered. I think, everybody heard the kind of Victoria Nuland fuck the EU kind of a leaked telephone conversation, sorry for my language, where it's very clear that she, didn't want the Europeans kind of fouling her turf. She very much saw the kind of US policymakers taking the lead on the kind of future resolution. She wanted to maneuver Arseniy Yatsenyuk into place as a future kind of leader of Ukraine, and hey presto, he became prime minister after Yanukovych was ousted. So, I mean, that is all kind of, in plain sight, public fact, look it up online. I mean, it all happened because of this kind of big tussle where the Americans felt nose out of joint about this big moment of European diplomacy. And as you correctly said, Aaron, I mean, people just shrugged their shoulders when, okay, I mean, Yanukovych was a dodgy and corrupt man, but I mean, Ukraine has lots of dodgy and corrupt men and women, let's be honest about it. I mean, as soon as he is out of the way, people shrugged their shoulders and said, well, it's too late now. Let's usher Tory's favourite son into power.
And what's amazing about Victoria Nuland is that's not her only moment of deliberately undermining, European-backed diplomacy to bring peace to Ukraine. So most people now know of the incident we just talked about, where Nuland's caught on tape saying "F the EU," and Yats is the guy. We're going to appoint him. We're going to basically support him as the next leader of Ukraine, which is exactly what happens after the coup. But then, so that's February 2014. That's January, February 2014. 1 year later, okay, that's when France and Germany are pushing through the Minsk Accords, which is an attempt to end the war that's begun as a result of the coup that Victoria Nuland backed. But just as the Minsk Accords are being finalized, so Merkel and Hollande are going to Moscow. They're meeting with Putin. They're getting Putin's buy-in on the Minsk Accords. Victoria Nuland is now in Munich on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, and she's meeting with a bunch of U.S. officials, including lawmakers like John McCain and Mike Pompeo, who goes on to become Trump's Secretary of State. And Nuland tells them in comments that are not reported in the U.S. media, but they did get reported in Germany. She basically says she's making fun of Merkel and Hollande for trying to do diplomacy with Putin. And she basically says, we're going to undermine whatever they do. We're going to keep shipping weapons to Ukraine, no matter what. European diplomats later complained that actually Nuland's very out of sync with Obama, because Obama in public is saying, no, we support diplomacy. We support the Minsk process. We support Merkel and Hollande as they're trying to make peace. But Nuland is basically saying behind the scenes to her own people, like, let's not worry about that. We're going to keep going and keep fighting Russia and Ukraine. And John McCain is there having a meltdown because he's comparing Merkel and Hollande to the appeasers of Hitler back in the Second World War. So were you aware of this during that time of like just how out of sync U.S. policy was publicly in supporting the Minsk Accords with what Victoria Nuland and her cohorts were doing behind the scenes?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And of course, the UK was very much in lockstep with Victoria Nuland too, because, she's talking to our people in London all the time about that. And, just within kind of 3 months of the Minsk Accords being agreed, there's this kind of subsequent agreement within the EU, very much brokered by the UK, that actually sanctions against Russia could only be lifted if there's this notion of the full implementation of the Minsk agreement. So what that did effectively, kind of with very much the US being the backseat driver to the UK on its internal EU kind of negotiations, was actually to kind of, basically lock in place sanctions permanently against Russia by this fanciful idea that Minsk could somehow be agreed in full at a time when neither the UK nor the US were putting any pressure on Ukraine to hold up its end of the Minsk agreements, i.e. specifically these negotiations around the devolution of power in the Donbass with the separatists. And so, it wasn't in Ukraine's interest to kind of see the Minsk agreements implemented, because had they done so, that would have then led to the possibility of sanctions relief against Russia. So that also locked in sort of Ukrainian behavior too, because they said, well, okay, we don't need to do anything now because sanctions against Russia have become permanent. So you can fast forward that to the end of 2021 and 2022. And, sanctions is a big golden ticket for Ukraine. I mean, even before war started, and Zelensky is calling for preemptive sanctions, no less, against Russia, even before Russia's ever actually done anything. So the whole thing becomes incredibly kind of bizarre. But I mean, if you take it back to kind of the period from March to kind of February to July 2015, then absolutely Tory Newland was behind the scenes. Certainly, I can't talk for the Germans and the French, but certainly on the UK side, very much kind of being the backseat driver there.
And the United States and England and the West in general constantly claims that they are rooting for Ukrainians and Ukrainian civilians, and that this is about democracy and freedom and standing in the way of authoritarianism. If the West actually cared about the lives of Ukrainians, what would their policy be, or what would their both behind the scenes and also official policies be in terms of this conflict?
Well, if they really cared, they would have got behind the Istanbul Agreement back in March 2022. But actually, they see this in zero-sum terms that kind of Russia has to lose. In fact, Boris Johnson, right at the start of the war, he said, not just Russia, but Putin, because this is all very much personalized around Putin. It isn't really about Russia. It's driven by this hatred of Putin. Putin must lose and be seen to lose. I mean, this was kind of Boris Johnson's mantra. And you kind of see that woven through all of the UK policy, that ultimately this will only end with a total defeat of Russia, which means a full restoration of Ukraine's 1991 borders, i.e. taking us back even pre, what happened in 2014, Crimea and Donbass and all the rest of it. So, completely unrealistic because, as we can see on the ground, Ukraine doesn't have the military capability to do that. NATO isn't deploying its own troops. Support for continued weapon supplies is dwindling. So how on earth is that actually ever going to happen? It's just a fantasy land, quite frankly.
Well, let's go to a clip because Boris Johnson recently admitted that for him, the whole Ukraine project is about defending Western hegemony. Those were his words. He said this recently right before Congress passed the $61 billion Ukraine proxy war funding measure. This is Boris Johnson.
Those heroic Ukrainians the weapons they so desperately need. Because if Ukraine falls, it will be a catastrophe for the West. It will be the end of Western hegemony, and we will have no one to blame but ourselves. Read my column in the Daily Mail.
It's a great plug for his column and for Western hegemony. Why do you think Boris Johnson's conception of Western hegemony is tied up in the fate of who rules over Eastern Ukraine and Crimea?
He's kind of locked in this. He's even trying to make his voice sound like Winston Churchill, isn't he? He's quite kind of bizarre. Look, there's this big tussle going on right now. What the Russians call this, fight for a multipolar world, where there are different kind of centers of power. And actually, for a long time, this kind of NATO expansion has really been an attempt to kind of broaden that kind of Western sphere of influence with the US, which basically constitutes 2/3 of NATO, kind of being in the driving seat of that. Putin has always kind of rejected NATO expansion. So this is a small part of a much bigger kind of, if you like, battle. It's not even an ideological battle. It's a battle where sort of certainly in Asia, the Chinese, and in the global South, people want to kind of move beyond the situation where the US is kind of the world's policeman, if you like. And I think that's what this kind of battle for hegemony, if you can even call it that, is about, this kind of quest for a multipolar world. But I mean, in that, Boris Johnson being a bit of a clown with his voice and all the rest of it, it was total nonsense. I mean, if that was so, then actually, the NATO should deploy its troops, and then we'll all be kind of screwed. I mean, let's try and make peace.
Boris Johnson recently met with the Azov Battalion and praised them. Let's take a look at this.
My message to you is very simple. Thank you to the heroes from the Azov Brigade who warned us about their presence tonight. Give the Ukrainians what they need. Give them the weapons. Give them the authorization to use those weapons outside their own borders if they're absolutely ludicrous that Ukrainians should be forbidden from doing what Putin is doing himself and attacking Ukrainian forces. Why on earth shouldn't Ukrainians be able to attack Russian forces mustering on their borders? Give them those weapons, give them the attackers, give them the budget, give them the air defences that they need. It's the single best investment that we can make in the defence of the whole Euro-Atlantic area, is supporting Ukrainian heroes. We rely wholly on heroes such as the people who are here tonight with us from the Azov Brigade.
So what are your thoughts on what he said? And then we'll talk about the timing of the lifting of the ban on providing the battalion with weapons. But yeah, what are your thoughts on his comments there?
Well, I think it's completely embarrassing, to be honest. This is a group with far right wing associations that's badge. Some people believe is a derivative of the Nazi swastika. We're inviting them to the UK, bringing them into Parliament. Apparently hosting them for drinks receptions on Pall Mall. Saying let's give them weapons. I mean, what sort of a clown does Johnson think he is? I mean, giving Ukraine a few more weapons for this kind of right-wing battalion will do nothing for US Atlantic security, as Russia has absolutely no stated desire to invade Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, take any from the list, which is often talked about in the press. So this is ridiculous. I mean, the only way out of this is not continuing to arm Russia, it's to kind of strive for peace.
And what are your thoughts on the timing of the lifting of the ban of providing Azov with weapons?
I just think it's a sign of the further moral degradation of kind of policy making in both Washington and the UK. Interestingly, actually, Canada has decided not to lift its ban. So thank God, sanity lives somewhere in the Western Alliance. But I just think it's kind of pure theatre and a sign of the ongoing moral degradation of kind of policy making in the West.
I want to shift to another proxy war for a second. Syria. The UK was very involved in the Syria dirty war. I'm curious, having served in the government at that time, was there any debate internally about whether or not it was a good idea to arm an insurgency that was dominated by Al-Qaeda and that also was giving rise to ISIS? Was that ever questioned inside the UK? Because I know there was some debate about this in the US, but obviously it didn't make a difference. One of the most expensive dirty wars in history.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We absolutely wanted to. I mean, policymakers absolutely wanted to get behind the effort to depose Assad. But of course, what they didn't expect was then, the massive vacuum that created in Syria that ISIS, started to feel, creating another problem. So, let's be absolutely clear that kind of policymakers, were fully behind, where the US was on, ridding Syria of Assad, but then had to retrofit their policy once we realized that actually this has caused a much bigger kind of, you cut off one head and two more reappear, right? Hydra, in the form of kind of ISIS. So yeah, I mean, I think it was completely irresponsible policy making that we're even dabbling in that in the context of a parliament that actually voted against kind of direct UK military involvement in what's happening in Syria in 2013.
And that was spurred. Why? Why did Parliament take that step? This was right when Obama was mulling strikes on Syria because Syria allegedly crossed the so-called red line by using chemical weapons, which I don't think is true. I don't think actually the Syrian government used chemical weapons, but that's another story. But what was that moment like when the parliament voted against military force?
Well, it was a shock. I mean, we'd followed the US into Libya, in 2011 at the height of the Arab Spring. We bombed the crap out of Libya. We got rid of Gaddafi, and then Libya became a total basket case on the back of that. And we're basically, the Americans were keen to do exactly the same thing in Syria, 2 years later. And Parliament said, well, hold on a minute. That didn't work out so well in Libya, did it? And let's not just wander into yet another kind of conflict that creates a much bigger conflict on the back of that. Let's not deploy kind of UK military force in that theatre. And I think that is really as simple as that. Going for, I mean, and bear in mind that kind of in the UK in particular, kind of our involvement in the second Iraq War in 2003 was massively unpopular in the UK. Widespread unrest. This idea that we're kind of going in driven by kind of moral righteousness and creating much bigger kind of problems in countries that are very far from our soil. Fast forward 2011, 2013, Parliament said, well, actually, no thanks. Let's not this time.
Yeah, with Libya and the UK, it's interesting. If I remember correctly, the UK Parliament did an investigation that basically debunked all of the lies that the US told to go into Libya. Among them, that Gaddafi was going to commit mass murder in Benghazi. The UK Parliament actually did an investigation of this and debunked it. Do I remember that correctly, or am I confusing that with
I've
something
not seen that, but I've got no reason to disbelieve you. I'll look it up after this. But yeah, I mean, I was involved actively in the Libya thing at the time. I actually organised the London conference on Libya at the height of this, kind of broker some sort of peace settlement. But yeah, I mean, the whole of North Africa was ablaze at that time. The Arab Spring spreading from Tunisia right the way across, to Egypt and so on. Why we chose at that time to kind of try and unseat our long-standing foe. I mean, he'd been around for 30, 40 years, Gaddafi, thought it was behind the Lockerbie bombing. We bombed him in the 1980s extensively. It's just another chance to settle old scores, it seems to me.
What are your thoughts on the upcoming presidential elections in the United States in terms of policy differences between Biden and Trump? Would there be differences on this issue of Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Trump has said he would end the war tomorrow. Whether he would, let's see. But I mean, he clearly, had a relationship, with Putin. I mean, he would talk to Putin. I mean, Biden and actually UK sort of, politicians too. The whole policy of the past 10 years, certainly on our side, and certainly under Biden's presidency, has been to kind of cancel, Putin. But I think at the very least, kind of Trump would reach out and engage. And actually, Trump is much more sanguine about actually the total failure of US policy in terms of arming Zelensky to fight the last Ukrainians. So I mean, I think there is scope, and I think actually you see that in what's happening today on the battlefield in Ukraine, where there's a real sense that kind of Russia's in a bit of a holding pattern, as it often does. This kind of looking up, see the lay of the land. The exact same thing happened in the run-up to the elections when Trump came to power last time. Putin pressed paused, waited to see, what would happen after Obama went out. And of course, things went belly up at that time because of the Katso Act, but that's another matter. So I personally think actually Trump would be more inclined to kind of broker some sort of ceasefire and peace process in Ukraine. There's absolutely no desire on the Biden administration to do that.
When it comes to Libya, I did look it up. There was a UK parliamentary report that said that the Libya intervention relied on flawed intelligence and it singled out your current foreign secretary, your former prime minister, David Cameron, who's now heading your foreign policy, despite his own record. I'm curious, as a diplomat, how much does the British government and its allies like the US, how much do they invest in propaganda, in deceiving the public into going along with, for example, their proxy wars, whether it's in Ukraine or Syria?
Well, they call it strategic communications, but that's basically what it is. It's propaganda. And in fact, our whole relationship with Russia since 2014 has been governed by strategic communications. And what I mean by that is we spend all of our time, through direct diplomatic channels and through the media, talking about Russia rather than talking to Russia. And why talk directly to Russia? Why talk to Putin when actually we can talk to the press about how bad Russia is and kind of handle things that way? So, strategic communications, propaganda, I mean, they're basically the same thing. UK policy certainly has been driven by stratcoms on Russia for the last decade, and that's absolutely certain.
This is a different topic, but I'm curious if you could shed some light on how the British government views Israel and Palestine. Obviously, in the United States, there's a very big lobby, Israel lobby. I know there is one in the UK, but can you talk a bit more about it and how whether or not you experience it at all?
I mean, I think the truth is that we have very little influence over what's happening there because of our baggage, in creating the situation that the two sides find themselves in today, and B, because the US has far more influence over Israel than we ever will have. So our policy position has been, as it has been, frankly, on Ukraine since 2014, to tuck in behind the US on that. There's been a real kind of nervousness about stepping away in terms of our public policy lines, on Ukraine. That's why, the UK government has never called for a full ceasefire, as far as I can see. I mean, a sustainable ceasefire, different caveated versions of ceasefire that don't actually mean a permanent ceasefire, on that. And that's why, we've been complicit in standing back while these horrendous atrocities have taken place. Now, of course, everybody, feels terrible about the atrocities of October the 7th too. But I mean, I think what this illustrates, which is exactly the same as what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, is that US and UK tendency to take one side in the conflict and not actually try and find a resolution that works for both sides. and I recognise that kind of Israel, kind of Palestine issue is a long-standing and an intractable thing, but actually simply kind of giving Israel a blank check to do whatever it's doing is not the answer, and is actually causing increasing kind of disenfranchisement in the wider Arab world and the global South more generally. I mean, at the kind of peace summit actually that in Switzerland at the weekend, it's fascinating that every single Middle Eastern state refused to engage with that peace document, with the exception of Qatar, which has been involved in the kind of hostage negotiation side of it. But the Middle East turned its back on the kind of Swiss peace summit. It's really fascinating if you look at the attendees and the numbers around that. So, yeah, I mean, I think people actually are fed up of kind of the US and our smaller, much smaller kind of friends in the UK, lapdogs, for want of a better term, actually just taking one side, and trying to pick winners in conflicts.
And can you elaborate on the role of England in this conflict when you refer to it as baggage?
Well, obviously, we were involved in the creation of the Israeli state, right? I mean, right back at the aftermath of the Second World War, after the actual horrendous atrocities of the Holocaust, and the need to find a kind of a home, a state for the Jewish people. I think we were involved. It was a kind of colony, if you like, of Palestine of the UK. We were involved in shaping, the Israeli state as we see it today, which actually then kind of fostered many of the problems that we see now. Unfortunately, although I'm sure policymakers weren't thinking about that at the time. So yeah, I mean, we have that baggage about how the kind of Israeli state was formed, which causes complications both in our relationships with Israel itself, but also, of course, in our relationships with the wider Arab world.
And of course, the Balfour Declaration.
Of course, yeah.
Yes, thank you for that, Ian. Thank you to your country for the Balfour. It's done so much wonders for the world.
My next book should be on the failures of British diplomacy.
Yeah.
Anything you want to leave us with, Ian, as we wrap?
No, I mean, I think all of this comes down to one thing. Ukraine can't win on its own in the battlefield if NATO isn't going to deploy its own troops to kind of force a military settlement, which would inevitably lead to nuclear escalation. If that's the option that we face, then actually we really should be striking for peace, and we should encourage Zelensky to put his suit back on and sit at the table with Putin. Trying to ignore Putin, cancel Putin, is not going to change anything. He's not going anywhere.
All right. Well, Ian Proud, we really appreciate your time. The book is called A Misfit in Moscow, How British Diplomacy in Russia Failed 2014 to 2019. It's a fascinating read. Rare to have an insider like yourself speak out. We're very grateful to you for taking the time to join us. So thank you.
Thanks. Really lovely to meet you both. All the best.
That was great. And I got to say, it's a good book. I started reading it. It's really good. It's very engaging. Lots of cool behind the scenes moments from working in diplomacy.
Yeah. And the book again is called A Misfit in Moscow, How British Diplomacy in Russia Failed. Very rare to get an insider, a Western insider, speak critically of Western policy against Russia. And so Ian Proud, I think, has done a real service here in giving us a different perspective because, as we talked about, right now, everything is so lockstep. Like the US and UK are so united behind this path of confrontation with Russia. And Ian Proud is an insider voice saying, actually, you know what? Why don't we try diplomacy rather than fueling a conflict between the world's top nuclear powers? Something to think about.
If only Antony Blinken could take some inspiration from Ian.
Yeah, not going to happen. Antony Blinken can't hear the calls for diplomacy over his guitar licks to Rockin' in the Free World and whatever blues songs he plays sometimes too.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Make sure that you join us at usefulidiots.podcast.com so you can see the full interview with Ian and also get access to our Thursday Throwdown, your midweek dose of media madness. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much for listening to and watching Useful Idiots. For extended episodes, bonus content, and our weekly Thursday Throwdown episode, please subscribe at usefulidiots.podcast.com. Support the show for free by subscribing on YouTube, Rumble, and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to rate and review. You can also follow us on Twitter at UsefulIdiotPod. Thanks for supporting independent media. We'll see you next time.